All right, let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this session. If you're looking for your Apex code in the Salesforce security model, you're in the right place. This is some information about making purchasing decisions with forward-looking statements. I don't plan on making any forward-looking statements, but if I do, or if you think I do, please follow this information. You can find the text of this on the Salesforce website. Hi, my name is Matt Qualiana. I'm a sales engineer at a company called Velocity. We're a Salesforce partner. We build industry-specific applications on top of the Salesforce platform. Specifically, we build applications for insurance, health insurance, telecommunications, and public sector. I work in the public sector part of our business. Before I was at Velocity, I spent a few years at Salesforce, also as a sales engineer in the public sector part of the Salesforce business. So my role at Salesforce was to help government agencies provide better service to citizens by adopting the Salesforce cloud. Today's presentation really has nothing to do with Velocity, but if you want to find me later, I'll probably be in the Velocity booth in the public sector area, so that's good to know. So our agenda today is this. We're going to start with a review of the Salesforce security model. I'm assuming that most folks here are familiar with Salesforce and have gone through some training and are admins or developers and understand security, but I think it's also important to review it because there's a lot of different moving parts, and it's good to get everyone on the same page before we get into the latter half of the presentation. So the first half of the presentation, as we get into it, if you say, yeah, I know all this, that's actually good, but we just want to get everyone on the same page. So we're going to start by reviewing how Salesforce security works and what all the different pieces and parts are, because there's actually many different pieces and parts. Then I'm going to discuss how your Apex code runs relative to that Salesforce security model, what it does and what it might not do that you might expect it to do. We'll follow that with a presentation to explain some of those ideas, and we'll also show you how to fix problems that you may run into, and I'll end by reviewing some best practices. So let's get right into it. When people think about security and Salesforce, the first thing that usually comes to mind are profiles. Every user in Salesforce has a profile, and that profile determines that user's CRUD access to object types. And when I say CRUD, that's a really nice acronym that means create, read, update, and delete. So for every single object in your Salesforce org, each user's profile tells them whether they can do those operations on each object type. Now, it's important to understand that profiles define access to the data type, or to the object type, but not to individual records, or if there's any object-oriented programmers in the room, not to specific instances of those object types. Profiles also give each user read or read-write access to each individual field on each object. So we get down to the field level, and you'll see this abbreviation throughout my slides and throughout the Salesforce content online on this topic, FLS, that stands for field level security. So the profiles determine for each user, can they access this object, can they access the fields on the object. Now, security also includes permission sets, because what happens is you start to create profiles, you assign profiles to users, those profiles determine the permissions for each of those users, but then you want to make an exception. You want to give this one user who has a particular profile one more additional thing. Do you create a new profile? You could, but it's better to create a permission set because permission sets let you cut down the number of profiles you're creating because you want to keep track of your profiles, and the more profiles you have, the harder it is to manage all of them. So permission sets let you extend profiles, and they're additive only, so they only add access. And any user in Salesforce can have any number of permission sets, 0 to whatever you want to assign to them. Now, another important topic in Salesforce security are the org-wide defaults, often referred to as OWD. OWD determines what happens in terms of access for any records where you are not the owner. So every single record in Salesforce of any type, whether it's a standard object or a custom object, has an owner. And the owner of any record can, of course, always access that record. But what about the other people who aren't the owners? So the org-wide defaults cover those situations. So if we think about an org where we've made the account record private via the org-wide defaults, private means that only the owner of that account can see that account. That account doesn't exist for any other users of the org. Now, we may not want to make it private. As you can see, there are many other options here. There's public read-write. There's public read-only. I'm not going to explain what all of these are, because as I said, this is a bit of a review. But org-wide defaults are really powerful. But it might have occurred to you, as I explained that example, that making accounts private may not be such a good idea, because doesn't my boss want to see the accounts that I own? And how would that work? And that's where we get into the role hierarchy. So in Salesforce, every user has to have a profile. And it's optional to give each user a role. But if you want to, you can define roles. You can assign a role to each user. Then you can organize those roles into hierarchies. And record ownership works in such a way that I own any record that I'm the owner of. That's kind of by definition. But I also am essentially the owner of any record that someone below me in the hierarchy, someone who reports up to me, is the owner of. So this makes it possible, once we organize users into a role hierarchy, for my boss and my boss's boss and my boss's boss's boss to see everything that I own. This is very common in really large organizations. When I worked at Salesforce, I could see opportunities in my organization, in my part of Salesforce, but I couldn't see sales opportunities just for the rest of the company, because that wouldn't make any sense from a business point of view, and role hierarchy was how they limited that. Now, another important piece of sharing are sharing rules. So sometimes there are situations where you want to give people access to records, but it's nothing that you can define as part of a hierarchy. It's kind of a special case. And sharing rules lets you do this. So this is an example. It's a little bit hard to read, so I'll walk you through it. I live in Austin, Texas, by the way, so I decided to use a Texas-centric example called Texas sharing. And in our situation, our example where the accounts are private, so that only the owner and the owner's managers can see an account, we've created a rule here called Texas sharing. And this little section here in the middle says that when the state equals Texas, share that account or any account where the state equals Texas with members of a group called Texas users. So we're letting any user who is in a group called Texas users have access to accounts where the state equals Texas, regardless of whether or not they would otherwise have access to it. Contacts are a bit of a special case. Contacts inherit their access from the account they roll up to. And contacts without an account are private and are only accessible by the owner. I've run into this before. I do a lot of demos. I'll create contacts. I'll forget to create an account to associate them with. And then later, I'll have all sorts of problems and can't figure out why I can't see that contact on the community, or there's some other problem. And then eventually, the light bulb goes off, and I realize, oh, I have to associate this contact with an account, and then I can get to it. All right, to review a few of those points, every user has a profile. This is a requirement. You have just one profile. Every user can have a role. It's not required. You don't need to use roles. You don't have to use roles. But roles are really handy. And for organizations of any meaningful size, you'll probably want to use roles. You can also assign any number of permission sets and sharing rules to a user. But you may also choose not to use these. They may not be necessary. This last point here, or second to last point, is one that you'll hear me repeat later. The profile plus permission sets, which are essentially extensions to the profile, plus the user's role and the hierarchy that that role falls into, plus the org-wide defaults, plus sharing rules, all combine to shape each user's access to data. So how they can get to records and fields and what they can do when they get there is all through the lens of all of these things. And all of your declarative configuration runs through all those filters. It runs inside of what we call the user's context. So all of your declarative configuration respects all of this and understands all this. So you add a field to a layout, but you have a user who doesn't have access to that field. The layout just magically doesn't show them that field. You have a workflow that operates on a particular field or record. It understands how to do that in context of the user. So declarative configuration, as you're probably all familiar with, does exactly what you'd expect it to do in terms of security. Let me walk you through just a quick example to finish the security summary the review, and then we'll talk about Apex. So in my example, we have an org. My clicker will work. And in this org, we've created a custom profile called Purchasing Agent. I should point out, by the way, that Salesforce ships with some number of standard profiles. It's usually considered a best practice to copy or clone one of those profiles and create your own custom profiles and assign those to users. You don't have to, but it's usually a good idea. So we have a profile called Purchasing Agent that we've created, and the Purchasing Agent has read, create, and edit access to accounts, but can't delete them. They can only read opportunities, and we have a custom object in this org called Purchase Order. As you might expect, the Purchasing Agent has pretty much full access to the Purchase Order object, and they also have full access to all the fields in the Purchase Order object. Now, in this fictitious organization that I'm using for my example, they buy a lot of stuff. They're a big company. So we don't just have one purchasing agent. We have lots of purchasing agents. We've organized them into a department. The head of that department is the VP of Procurement. The VP of Procurement has 2 managers, one for East and one for West. And each of those managers has multiple purchasing agents that roll up to him or her. And the purchasing agent profile would be assigned to one of these individuals. And in this org, the org-wide defaults for the purchase order object are set to private, meaning that only a purchasing agent can see their own purchase orders. But because we're in a role hierarchy, that also extends to the purchasing manager and to the VP of Procurement. So the VP of Procurement can see all of them. The purchase manager can see all of the purchase orders created by the people that roll up to him or her, and the individuals can only see their own. So the profile plus permission sets are how we know that the purchasing agent can access that object and the fields on that object. Those are the 2 things that you might use to give access to a record type, to a data type into the fields. And then the role plus the hierarchy plus org-wide defaults plus sharing rules, if there are any, will all combine to create this intersection between the data type and the individual records, and to, again, as I say, shape each user's access to data. So some other purchasing agent in a different part of the organization may not be able to see these purchase orders, but might be able to see different purchase orders. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. Hopefully it's a review. Now let's talk about Apex, because this is where things get a little interesting. So if you remember nothing else from this session, if you walk out of here and go out and have a really good time tonight, and tomorrow someone says, what about that Apex session you went to? And you can't really form a lot of coherent ideas from it, please remember this. This is the most important thing of all this. Apex runs in the system context, not the user context. So when you write a bunch of code and you're thinking, oh, this code is going to behave a certain way because it's running inside the context of the logged in user, you're mistaken. Apex runs in the system context. It has a completely different set of rules than the user context. Now that being said, don't get too freaked out, because in most cases, Apex does what you want it to do in terms of security. And in almost all cases, Apex does the right thing. And I'm going to talk about the situations where it doesn't. But in almost all cases, Apex does what you'd expect it to. So I don't want you to get too freaked out. But if you're going to remember one thing, definitely remember that first point. As I said, Apex has a few situations where you, as the developer, have the power to decide what you want to do. So the first one of those situations involves where you create a controller. When you start to create a controller, or in my example here, a controller extension, this is a controller extension that I'll be running here in a few minutes in the demo. If you use the keywords with sharing, even though your controller is still running in the system context, that forces your controller to respect the org-wide default, role hierarchy, and sharing rules for this user. So that's actually really powerful. Those 2 words make your code behave the way that you want it to for that user. And if you don't use with sharing, then your code's running in the system context, and you may get very different results than you'd expect it to. Now, I don't have a demo of this, because this is pretty straightforward. You use these 2 words. It does these things. You don't, it doesn't. The next topic I want to talk about, though, are controllers. So as you would probably expect, standard controllers fully enforce field level security. So even though the code of the page is running in the system context, the controllers, the standard controller implementations understand the user and the user's limitations, and they enforce field level security. Custom controllers, and I should also add controller extensions, which is what I'll really be demoing, but it's the same thing for our purposes, enforce field level security when you're making a direct reference. Let me explain that. So in my controller, let's say it's a controller for contacts. And somewhere in my code, I create a new contact. And now I want to take the current contact from the controller and assign that into this new contact. That's a direct reference. So that sort of behavior happens with field level security being fully enforced. But when you're making an indirect reference in a controller, your Apex code does not automatically enforce field level security. And what's an indirect reference? Well, I'm about to show you one, but I'll describe it first for a moment here. In the example I'm about to show, we're going to query the field of a contact, and then we're going to assign that value into a string. So now we're not going from contact to contact, we're going from contact field to string. And in that operation, field level security is not enforced. There's a way to fix it. Let me switch over to a browser and show you all this. OK. So we're going to start by looking at this contact, Timbar. And I should explain, for the purposes of this demonstration, I actually have two browser windows open. The first one is a user running using the system administrator profile, so they have full access to everything and essentially all-powerful. And this other browser that has the black bar at the top, this is a different user I've created that has a profile. Actually, maybe I don't. Let me just double check that. Murphy's Law of Demos. The more people who are in the room, the more likely something is to not behave the way you expect it to. All right. So now we're running with a user who I named limited access, so I'd be sure not to screw it up. And that limited access user has a profile called limited access. And we're going to go look at a contact here. And we have access to all of the standard out-of-the-box fields for the contact, but I've added a field that we don't see here because my profile doesn't let us see it. And we'll go back to our full access browser and take a look at that. So under full access, I see this field here called favorite color. It's a text field. Timbar's favorite color is red. Now, if I look at the profile for this limited access user, that's the profile that's being used in the other browser. I can see the permissions on this object are read, create, edit, and delete, so we have full CRUD access. If we go down to all the individual fields, I find the favorite color field here. And I can see that I don't have any access. I don't have read access. I don't have read-write access. Obviously, I have no access at all. So as far as any user with this limited access profile is concerned, favorite color doesn't exist inside the system context. So now let's see what happens when we start to write some code and we execute it inside both users. So we'll go back to the record for Timbar. I've created a few Visualforce pages to demonstrate different scenarios. The first one is just using a standard controller. So it's a simple Visualforce page that shows me the contact name and the text of the favorite color field. And as you can see, it does exactly what you expect it to do. I didn't show the code for this because this is very simple. It's just the standard controller. Now, if I switch over to the limited access user, and I bring up the standard controller example as well, you'll notice that there is no value displayed for favorite colors. Exact same code. It's just that the apex, actually in this case, there really is no apex. It's just Visualforce, which we could say is a form of apex, but for our purposes, the Visualforce is using the standard controller, and the standard controller knows how to enforce field level security. So this does exactly what we expect it to do. That's great. It's not that interesting, but it's a good foundation. So now what if we want to do something a little bit more colorful, so to speak? What if rather than showing me the word red, we wanted to see a rectangle, a patch of color, showing me this user's favorite color? And the way I've done this is I have a method in my controller called getFavoriteColor. And the Visualforce is calling this method. And that method is returning not the string, but a hex value for the color. So up at the top of the page where we draw the rectangle, it's using that hex value to draw the line and the fill color for the rectangle. So that's great. That looks nice. But this is where we start to get into trouble. Where we start to get into trouble is this line right here. Because what we're doing in this line is we are assigning the favorite color field from the contact into my string called fcall, and then later I'm using that string to then convert the string into a hexadecimal, and then I'm going to return the hexadecimal. And by doing that, that line right there is where your Apex is not enforcing field level security. And to illustrate that point, we'll switch back to the other browser. We'll do the exact same thing. And although the standard controller didn't show us the string value of red inside the code, it assigned red into fcolor, and then we returned the hex value. And now, potentially, we've just leaked some information to the user that we might not have wanted to do. Now, I say it that way because I don't know exactly what the business requirement is. It might be that we can't show them the string, but it's OK to show them the color. But it's important to understand what Apex is doing and to know that this is happening. And you may not want this to happen. Let's assume that we don't. Let's assume that we don't want the favorite color to be known by this user, whether it's in string form or it's in visual form. But that information is private for whatever reason. So how do we fix that? How do we ensure that for some users we show the color, and for other users we don't? We do that based off their profile. How can we make that happen? The good news is it's one line of code. So let me switch back over and I'll show you. So for the full access user, the behavior is exactly the same. But in red, I have highlighted this additional line of code. I'll bring this up here a little bit. So we're using a method on the schema object called isAccessible. And we're testing to see if this field, favorite color, is accessible to the current user. So this is adding field level security to my code where otherwise it does not exist. Now, like I said, the behavior is no different for this user because this user has access, so we can't really see it in action. But if we switch back to this browser, and we see the exact same code, we notice that now it's gone back to the behavior of the standard controller. It's just not showing anything. As far as this user is concerned, there is no favorite color. And this one line of code is what solves the problem for you. And like I said, if you remember just one thing from the session, remember that your Apex doesn't run in the user context. It runs in the system context. This line of code is forcing my controller to respect the user context, essentially. Now, it's only in this type of situation where we're leaving we're not going from object to object, but we're going from object to a variable, to a generic, to a primitive. But when you do that, you need to be careful to test for accessibility.
Does that apply when you with sharing queue?
So with sharing, it doesn't involve this. The with sharing involves org-wide defaults, role hierarchy, and sharing roles. I just put with sharing in there because it's a best practice, and we want to use it throughout all of our code. But the with sharing really has no applicability to this issue. All right, so let's talk about some best practices. This first one is actually really important. There's another way of saying this. Don't write code. And I'm being a little funny, but not entirely. So I took it was nice. When I was a Salesforce employee, you're able to go to any training class that is offered if your schedule allows it, essentially at no cost if there's seats available. And I took advantage of that. So I took an Apex class that came to Austin, where I live. And the instructor did something pretty smart. He told us this at the beginning of the week. He said, even though it was an Apex class, he said, don't write code. I'm going to teach you a lot about writing code, but my advice to you is to not do it, unless you have to. So every now and then, he'd give us an exercise, to go off and do this in your training org. But the right way to do it was, there was a way to do it with configuration. And he'd let us struggle with writing code for about 10, 15 minutes. And then he'd ask us how it was going. And we'd tell him, oh, I'm having trouble getting this to compile. He's like, why are you writing code? So the example I just used, for example, didn't need code. I needed an example that I could show you folks, so I wrote some code. But I could have had a formula field that took the string value and, using a nested set of if statements, returned that hex value. And that formula field didn't need to be shown on the record. And then we could protect that formula field with field level security and run it all through the user context. And then we'd never have to worry about it. I don't have to write the code. I don't have to test the code. I don't have to write the unit test for the code. I could have done that example a couple of ways without writing code. So as much as this is a session on Apex, my first piece of advice is, as much as possible, don't write code. I have a background in development, and when I first got into Salesforce and went through training, I was just blown away by how many things I could do without ever writing code. So clicks, not code. I'm a big believer of that. But there will be times when you do have to write code, obviously. So when possible, use standard controllers, because they're just going to do the right thing for you. But that doesn't always meet your requirements. So then when you start to write your custom controllers or controller extensions, use direct references to objects and fields whenever possible. And hopefully, after that example, you understand what I mean by a direct reference as opposed to an indirect reference. This is not something that I showed, but I wanted to add it because I think it's a nice little tip here, is that in your Visualforce, use input field instead of input text whenever possible, because input field understands field level security. So it will automatically disable a field if the user doesn't have write access to that field. If you use input text, then you've got to manage that yourself. And use the with sharing keywords, which again, what that does, it enforces the org-wide defaults, the role hierarchy, and the sharing rules for the object and for the user. So more best practices. This is what we saw. So as needed, and hopefully you understand when it's needed. Yes?
Can you go back to the previous slide? So you said that you use input field, it respects the FLS permission, right?
Correct.
So even if you use indirect reference, it will still respect?
You can't. No, the input field is bound to a field. This is in Visualforce.
Oh.
Yes, this is why. That's why I didn't show an example. This is a little bit out of scope of today. I kind of slipped that in just because I read it while I was prepping for this. Like, I need to stick that in there somewhere. So, but that's in Visualforce. So some more best practices. And this is what we saw the example of. Add security checks as needed. And there's actually 4 different methods on the schema object that are useful. We saw is accessible. There's also creatable, updatable, and deletable. And by the way, I'm a little disappointed that someone at Salesforce didn't make this is readable, because then you'd have our CRUD. We could get back to our CRUD acronym, because everyone loves to stand up at conferences and talk about CRUD, right? Another important best practice is I've been talking about controllers, but remember that the same applies to your code, your web services code. It also runs in the system context. If you're you're writing some web services, you're exposing something to the outside world, you want to make sure that the logged in user, again, that user's context is not respected in certain cases in your code. So you want to make all these same tests. Think of it as the exact same problem. And this last one is really important. As a sales engineer, I go out and I build demos and I show it to customers, and I don't get so involved in deploying to production. That luckily gets to be somebody else's job. So I don't do a lot of testing because we're building demos, but I'm very familiar with this problem from previous experiences and previous lives. And definitely when you're testing, test with the same profile as your user has. Don't test with the sysadmin profile. Be sure to test using real profiles so you can, and then test for these conditions. So I want to end with some official guidance from Salesforce, and you can find this information at this page, testing CRUD and FLS enforcement. You can see I'm not the only one who uses this acronym. It's very popular. So Salesforce tells you, as a developer writing Apex code, you must always enforce CRUD and field level security on all standard objects and fields. That's their expectation of any developer. That's what they want you to do. And you should always enforce CRUD and field level security on your objects, on custom objects and fields, unless you have a really good reason not to. These are your objects as a developer, so you have a little more leeway, but you need to give yourself a good reason why you haven't done that, because otherwise you're sort of breaking the promise of the platform. The platform has all this great security baked into it, as we saw at the beginning. And if you are not using the with sharing keyword, and if you're not testing for certain edge cases and making sure you're not leaking data, then you're not in alignment with that promise of security. One last thing that I'll add, since we have a few minutes left, I'll let us out early, even better. As I was preparing this, I was thinking, well, what would be a use case? Like, why would I want Salesforce to behave this way? And it occurred to me that the whole reason to write code is to implement requirements that can't be done via point and click, via declarative. So, although I haven't run across this in the wild, imagine a use case where there's a field that a user can access certain times of the day. So during business hours, someone can see this value. But after business hours, they can't. They can see the rest of the values, but not this one. Or if the value in this field is of a certain, exceeds a certain amount, then we can show this one. There's no way to set up those sort of complex rules for field access in a profile. A profile is you can get to it, and you either have read access, you have read-write access, and that's it. You can always get to it under these conditions. So if you had some situation where the requirement was much more complex, there are some rules around, whether or not we're going to let you see this data, and that's determined dynamically. This is actually a great place to use this, and you could then implement all that in Apex and meet the business requirement. So I want to thank you for coming. I know that everyone always has like 5 sessions on their schedule that they would like to go to at the same time, and I appreciate you picking mine. I'll stick around for a few minutes afterwards, and hope you have a great Dreamforce.